He humiliated her in front of the whole family, then kicked her out of the house. But she didn't leave silently. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The clapping was deafening, but all Naomi Harris could hear was the quiet thrum of her own heartbeat, loud and private against the backdrop of the glittering stage. Another award, another headline, another uncomfortable dress tailored to fit the version of herself she presented to the world. Somewhere in the front row, a man from the Tribune raised his camera. She smiled, practiced, and composed, and accepted the plaque they handed her like a formality. The crowd rose, a standing ovation. She nodded with grace, stepping back from the microphone, her fingers brushing the smooth edge of the wooden base. An award for civic innovation in urban architecture, her third this year. She could already picture the articles. Chicago's own Naomi Harris transforms the South Shore, a daughter of resilience, visionary of the people. The titles always felt grander than the woman beneath them. She didn't feel like a visionary. She felt tired. After the photos, after the cocktails and polite congratulations from strangers who knew nothing about her, beyond the LinkedIn bio and the design portfolio, Naomi walked alone to her car parked in the rear lot. The evening was cool, unusually so for May. A breeze threaded through the alleys and past the construction scaffolding of a city always in flux. She unlocked the driver's side with a click and sat inside the hush of her Lexus, pressing her head briefly against the steering wheel. The plaque sat on the passenger seat beside her. She stared at it, unreadable. It didn't mean nothing. It just didn't mean what she'd hoped. The truth was simple. Her father would never see this. Not the applause. Not the redesigned housing complex she spent 2 years fighting for. Not the mural in the community center bearing her name. Not the press or the praise or the impact. Not because he was dead. He was alive, healthy, and thriving in Georgia with his church empire and his stoic sermons and his perfect, curated image. He simply chose not to look. Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant, confirming a press interview scheduled for Tuesday. Another from the city planner about permits. And, among the noise, one message from a number labeled simply Mama. It read, "Your father's 65th birthday is in 3 weeks. He's hosting a gathering. Family, friends, church members. It would mean something if you came. Please." Naomi stared at the message for a long time. 3 weeks. She hadn't been home in nearly a decade. The last time she'd set foot on Harris property was the year she turned 25, when she flew down with a scholarship offer in her bag and a master's degree in the works. Her father had barely glanced at her papers. He'd made a single comment about women in construction and then offered a dry, "God bless you." That was the extent of his warmth. He hadn't even said happy birthday. She closed the message without replying. The answer was obvious, wasn't it? Except the next morning, she found herself researching rare architectural salvage in Georgia. Something meaningful, something that could perhaps pass for a peace offering. She told herself it wasn't about wanting his approval. She had outgrown that, hadn't she? She was an adult, accomplished, independent. She no longer needed anything from him. Still, when she placed the order for a restored corner piece from the original Harris Chapel, her grandfather's church, long since torn down and replaced by glass monstrosities, she felt something sharp twist beneath her ribs. The piece would arrive the day before the event. She told herself it was symbolic, respectful, not emotional. The following week, she stood in front of the full-length mirror in her condo, dressed in a sleek navy pantsuit and low heels. Professional, controlled. Her apartment was immaculate, minimalist, filled with clean lines and concrete and glass, as if trying to counter the clutter she carried internally. Framed blueprints lined one wall. A framed childhood photo sat alone on a bookshelf. Naomi at 7, wearing her Sunday dress, hands folded, looking up at a man who never looked down at her. That photo had survived every move, every purge. She'd kept it, though she didn't know why. The look on her face haunted her, open, eager, unknowing. On her desk lay the most recent city contract she'd landed, a redevelopment project for a historical block in Bronzeville. It was the kind of win that would make her name permanent in the architecture world. But even as she reviewed the details, her mind wandered. To the south, to the red-bricked house she hadn't seen in years, to the man who once held her infant body and decided on some level that it didn't belong to him. She remembered the silence. Childhood had been a series of measurements. Sit straight, speak softly, memorize scripture, dress with modesty, achieve excellence. There had been rewards for obedience, never affection. She'd graduated top of her class, won awards for design as early as high school, spoke at a statewide competition her senior year. Her father had sent her a 2-line email. Saw your name in the paper. Keep your focus on the Lord. He never came to her ceremonies, never asked to see her work. When she applied to MIT, he suggested she consider Bible college instead. He had adored his nephews, Michael and James, 2 confident boys who volunteered at the church, studied business, married early, and stayed close. They were everything Naomi wasn't. Predictable, clean-cut, devoted to the legacy of Harris men. She was the outlier. Her mother, Karen, had always tried to buffer the impact. She'd sit on Naomi's bed late at night whispering reassurances, folding laundry. He's just strict because he sees your potential. But even then, Naomi had known that wasn't true. There was a coolness in his eyes when he looked at her. Not indifference, rejection. The thought of returning to that house made her stomach twist, and yet something inside her refused to let it go. She needed closure, or clarity, or maybe just the finality of proving that she had become everything he thought she couldn't. So she booked the flight, ordered the historical gift, and began preparing for the return like one would prepare for war. Each day leading up to her departure, she felt a shift. Old wounds rose quietly. She found herself looking longer at old photos. She called her mother for the first time in months. The conversations were brief, but warmer than expected. Her mother asked about her projects, her health, her life, asked gently if she was seeing anyone. Naomi lied and said she was too busy. It was easier than explaining that the walls she'd built didn't leave much room for intimacy. The night before the flight, she sat in bed with the folder of her original DNA test results. It had started innocently, a mail-in genetic test for health and ancestry, a curiosity, but the results had stunned her. She'd expected to see ties to the Harris line. There were no matches, not even distant. Her maternal links were strong, but the paternal side, blank. She'd submitted a second test through a private service, just to confirm. When the second result arrived, she'd sat motionless for hours. Jonathan Harris was not her biological father. She hadn't told anyone. She hadn't confronted her mother, not yet. She had stared at the data, the science, the unyielding percentages. The conclusion was clear, but the implications, they unraveled everything. And yet, somehow, they explained so much. The coldness, the neglect, the indifference that made no sense for a man who could be so warm with others. He had known, or suspected, and he'd punished her for it, silently and consistently, for 3 decades. She slipped the sealed result into her purse that night, not because she planned to use it. She wasn't seeking confrontation, but carrying the truth made her feel less helpless, less invisible. When her plane touched down in Georgia the next afternoon, Naomi felt like she was stepping back into a version of herself she had long buried. The humidity clung to her like memory. She rented a car and drove past streets she hadn't seen in years, noting what had changed, what remained the same. The town was still quiet, still caught somewhere between tradition and stagnation. The house was exactly as she remembered. White columns, meticulously kept lawn, the American flag waving gently on the porch. It looked like a photograph. Clean, composed, lifeless. Her mother greeted her at the door, eyes wide and moist. "You look so grown," she said, pulling Naomi into a hesitant hug. Naomi inhaled her perfume, soft, floral, familiar. Inside, the house was immaculate, not a photo out of place. The guest list for the party was framed and hung in the hallway. A printed program, a speech schedule. Of course. Her father was not home when she arrived. He was at the church, finalizing Sunday logistics. Karen led her upstairs to the guest room. "You can rest or come sit in the garden later," she said. Naomi nodded. The room smelled the same, lavender and lemon polish. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the childhood photos on the dresser. Michael's graduation, James's wedding, a family portrait from 15 years ago. She was in none of them. The plaque from Chicago was in her suitcase, still wrapped. The sealed envelope with the DNA test lay next to it. She didn't know what she would do with it, but she had brought it. That, in itself, felt like the beginning of something, or the end. Morning light broke softly through the curtains of the guest room, casting slanted shadows across the carpet. Naomi sat at the edge of the bed, still in the clothes from the night before, one hand resting lightly on the leather handle of her suitcase. She hadn't slept. Not really. Her body had rested, but her mind moved in tight, circular patterns, tracing memories, reassembling moments, revisiting conversations that now felt sharper with the knowledge she carried. The silence in the house was thick. Her mother had gone downstairs before dawn to begin preparing for the guests, and the rest of the rooms remained still. Naomi stood slowly, her limbs heavy, and crossed to the mirror near the dresser. The woman who stared back at her didn't look like a daughter returning home. She looked like a visitor, polite and out of place. The soft waves in her hair had flattened overnight, her eyes were shadowed, but her posture remained rigid. That was something her father had taught her, though perhaps not intentionally. Stand straight, look respectable, never let them see the wound. She pulled open her suitcase and removed a fresh blouse, charcoal gray with clean lines and a high collar, the kind of garment that spoke before she did. She dressed quickly, tied her hair back, and moved downstairs, her heels muffled against the thick runner along the staircase. Her mother was in the kitchen, chopping fruit with meticulous precision, her movements efficient and silent. "Morning," Naomi said. Karen glanced up, startled, then smiled. "You're up early. I thought you might want to sleep in." "I didn't." Naomi paused, uncertain of how to bridge the gulf between them. "You need help?" Her mother shook her head. "It's mostly done. Caterers will handle the rest. I'm just trying to keep busy." They stood in awkward stillness for a moment. Naomi studied her mother's hands, delicate and lined with age. The same hands that had once plaited her hair every Sunday, that had pressed sandwiches into her lunch bag, that had cupped her cheek after her first heartbreak. They were careful hands, dutiful, quiet. "What time is he getting back?" Naomi asked. "Around noon. He wanted to make sure everything's in place at the church before the guests start arriving. Of course he did. Naomi turned toward the back door. "I'll sit outside for a bit." The garden was largely unchanged, a square of green enclosed by rose bushes and trimmed hedges with a white bench near the center, her mother's sanctuary. As a girl, Naomi had watched her mother here, tending the soil, pruning the blossoms, sometimes humming softly. It had always seemed like the only place where Karen could be something close to herself. Naomi sat on the bench and drew a long breath. The Georgia air was thick with jasmine and old ghosts. Her thoughts turned again to the DNA test. She hadn't told her mother, not explicitly, but that moment was coming. It pressed against her chest like a weight, waiting for its turn. She thought back to the first test. It had arrived in the mail months earlier, a glossy box with cheerful branding and promises of self-discovery. She hadn't expected much. Curiosity had driven her. She was mapping the cultural histories of South Side neighborhoods for a future project and wanted to better understand the diasporic patterns in her own lineage. It was academic, detached, but the results had jarred her. No matches to the Harris family, not even second cousins. Her maternal matches were intact and predictable, but the paternal side was a void. She had assumed an error, entered her information again, waited. The second test was through a private clinic in Chicago, discreet and clinical. She'd brought in the hair sample herself, wrapped carefully in a plastic sleeve, taken from the bristles of her father's hairbrush during one of his rare visits north for a conference. He hadn't noticed, or if he hadn't said anything. She remembered sitting across from the technician's desk when the results came in, her eyes scanning the lines of data. No biological relationship. The conclusion was unmistakable. She was not his daughter, not in the biological sense. She'd folded the paper, placed it in a sealed envelope, and slipped it into her purse without a word. That envelope had traveled with her everywhere since. Unopened again, but never far. The test had confirmed something she'd felt her entire life, that she was a foreign body within the Harris lineage, tolerated but never truly accepted. Her father's coldness, his measured silences, his aversion to touch, all of it came into focus. She looked down at her hands. They were strong, long-fingered, with short, practical nails. Not like her father's at all. Her skin tone was slightly lighter than his, her hair softer in texture. Things people had occasionally commented on, then dismissed. But now the difference seemed glaring. Voices filtered through the open windows as the day moved on. Her mother coordinating deliveries, calling names, checking the program. Naomi remained in the garden, still and observant. By noon, the house had begun to swell with activity. Her cousins arrived first, filling the space with the confident laughter of people who had never questioned their place in the family. Michael's voice rang out from the hallway. "Is the old man making us wait again?" James followed, already wearing a pressed blazer and talking on his phone. They nodded to Naomi with a kind of distant courtesy, like acknowledging a guest speaker at an event they were obligated to attend. She nodded back, her smile minimal. She moved to the front sitting room, away from the cluster. The room had changed since she was a child, new upholstery, brighter colors, but the framed images remained the same. Her father's degrees lined one wall. A large oil painting of her grandfather preaching hung above the mantel, and beside it, a collage of photographs, birthdays, graduations, family trips. Naomi scanned each one. She appeared in only two. In both, she stood at the edge of the frame. At 2:15, her father returned. The room shifted when he entered, as it always had. People straightened, voices lowered. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to control. He wore a crisp white shirt and navy trousers, his silver hair neatly combed, his expression unreadable. "Naomi," he said, acknowledging her with a nod. His voice held no warmth, no anger either, just neutrality. As if she were another guest, distantly familiar but not essential. "Dad," she replied. They stood across the room from each other, separated by furniture and years of silence. He turned away first, addressing the others with his usual blend of formality and charm. Naomi watched him. She wondered how much he had known. When he had known. If he had always seen her as a symbol of something broken. A reminder of a promise kept out of obligation rather than affection. Her mother called her into the kitchen an hour later. The restored piece from the old chapel had arrived, a dark wood carving of a corner panel, polished and preserved. Naomi helped carry it to the sitting room, unwrapping the cloth with care. Karen clasped her hands together. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Naomi nodded, her throat tight. They positioned it against the far wall, under the photo of her grandfather. Naomi stepped back, brushing her palms on her slacks. Her father entered the room, drawn by the movement. Naomi straightened. "It's from the original Harris Chapel. I had it restored. It's my gift." He stared at it. A long moment passed. Then, "Where did you get it?" "A salvage yard in Macon. They kept a few pieces from the demolition. It took time to track it down." He nodded slowly, then looked at her. "You didn't need to go to all that trouble." She waited. For a thank you, for acknowledgement. Nothing came. He turned away, calling for one of the deacons to come see it. As he spoke to the man, he gestured at the panel with the pride of someone who had acquired it himself. Naomi stepped out of the room. She sat on the steps of the back porch, staring at the lawn. The ache behind her eyes pulsed. She breathed slowly, trying to will the tears away. It wasn't a surprise, but it still hurt. By late afternoon, the house was full. Men in suits, women in hats and gloves, children in Sunday best. The event began to unfold like a church service, organized, reverent, hollow. Naomi floated through it like a ghost. She responded to greetings, smiled politely, accepted comments on her busy city life. When asked about marriage, she deflected. When praised for her ambition, she nodded. It was performance. She had rehearsed these lines for years. She caught her father across the room, speaking with a state senator. He gestured toward Michael and James, recounting their accomplishments. Naomi watched, unnoticed. When her name was mentioned, it was in passing, as if she were a footnote. "She's in Chicago now," he said, "doing something with buildings." The senator nodded. "A fine young woman." Her father gave a tight smile. "Ambitious, certainly, though she tends to go her own way." That evening, Naomi stood alone near the artifact she had gifted him. The wood glowed softly under the lamplight. She touched its edge, her fingers tracing the grain. She felt the envelope in her purse like a heartbeat. She wasn't sure yet what she would do with it. But the illusion of belonging had begun to crumble. And once illusions crack, they rarely survive the pressure of truth. The house swelled with people, a steady tide of guests arriving in waves, each one more familiar with each other than with her. Naomi stood near the staircase, watching the flow of greetings, hugs, and laughter, like an anthropologist observing a culture to which she did not belong. The foyer buzzed with polished shoes and pressed dresses, The low hum of choir members and deacons exchanging inside jokes, neighbors dropping off pies, and old church ladies speaking in hushed reverence about the pastor's legacy. Everyone seemed to know exactly where to stand, what to say, how to contribute to the performance of harmony. She remained still, invisible to most, nodding politely when someone acknowledged her presence. Her mother flitted through the rooms like a shadow, smiling, smoothing, adjusting things no one else noticed. Her dress was elegant but modest, a soft lilac shade that blended perfectly with the floral arrangements. Naomi watched her closely, the way she adjusted a crooked plate, the way her eyes flicked to the door every time a new guest arrived. Karen was a master of silent navigation. It was a performance she had perfected across decades, and Naomi recognized it all too well. By late afternoon, the house had transformed. The formal dining room had been converted into a reception space, complete with a long buffet of catered Southern food, a linen-draped cake table, and a makeshift platform for the inevitable speeches. In the backyard, folding chairs had been arranged in orderly rows facing the porch, where a small podium waited for the man of the hour. Naomi avoided that area. She knew what would unfold there. She had lived through it too many times not to anticipate every word before it was spoken. Inside, she moved quietly from room to room, carrying a glass of lemonade she didn't drink, listening to conversations that blurred together. Everywhere she turned, she saw reminders of the family narrative. Framed newspaper clippings about her father's early years in ministry, photos of church buildings he'd renovated, stories recounted by guests of the impact he'd made in their lives. People spoke of him like a prophet, flawed but chosen. Naomi heard their reverence and felt the weight of her own estrangement grow heavier. Michael and James made their rounds with confidence, their wives at their sides, perfectly dressed and impeccably mannered. They exchanged compliments, cracked jokes, and fielded praise like seasoned politicians. Their children clung to their legs or ran through the hallways laughing, adding texture to the illusion of legacy. Naomi watched James accept congratulations on his recent promotion in the family trust. He handled the attention effortlessly, with the ease of someone who had never doubted his worth. When someone mentioned Naomi's work in Chicago, he smiled as though correcting a misstatement. "Oh yeah," he said, "Naomi's got her own thing going on. She's been up there for years. A little disconnected from things here, but we're proud of her." The words were harmless on the surface, but she recognized the undercurrent, the subtle reminder that she was not part of the core. Not truly, not ever. When her mother called her aside briefly to introduce her to one of the pastors from her father's ministry network, the exchange was predictably shallow. "This is my daughter, Naomi," Karen said softly. The pastor, an older man with a thick mustache and a booming laugh, shook her hand. "Oh, yes, the architect. We've heard about you. You're doing good work in the city, I hear." "Thank you," Naomi replied, her voice even. "You ever think about coming home? There's always room for strong minds in the South, you know." Naomi smiled thinly. "My work is rooted in the communities I grew up near. I'm right where I need to be." He chuckled, not catching the tension in her tone, and moved on. Her mother lingered for a moment. "He meant well," Karen murmured. Naomi didn't answer. Later, just before dinner, Naomi decided to visit the formal living room, the most curated space in the entire house. Every object there had been selected by her mother but approved by her father. Aesthetic judgment passed through the filter of legacy. The room had always struck Naomi as a set piece, rather than a place for actual living. Furniture was arranged for symmetry, not comfort. The rug beneath her feet was a Persian import, and the coffee table bore a stack of untouched theology books alongside a single glass sculpture. It was a room for showing, not feeling. And there, in the far corner near the fireplace, stood the artifact she had brought, the salvaged piece of the old Harris chapel. It had been polished again, adjusted slightly, perhaps by one of the house staff or her mother. It gleamed under the soft lamplight, but it was tucked out of direct view, positioned like an afterthought, a decoration, a historical trinket. Her chest tightened. It had been a generous gift, symbolic, meant to show reverence, connection, respect, and it had been hidden. Her father hadn't mentioned it in his greetings. No one had brought it up. It was there, like she was there, present but peripheral. She was still standing in front of it, her fingers lightly brushing the edge, when the door opened behind her and her father entered. He paused at the threshold, then stepped forward. Naomi straightened instinctively, her shoulders pulled back, chin lifted. He glanced at the artifact, then at her. "Someone told me you found that in Macon," he said. "I did," she replied. "It belonged to the original chapel." He nodded. "I remember that corner. There was a hairline crack through it. I had it stabilized. It won't split." A beat passed. He looked at her with that same detached gaze she had known all her life, assessing, not seeing. "Symbolic," he said finally. Naomi nodded. "I thought so." Another silence. "You always did like artifacts," he added. "Things that have a story to them." "I guess I do." He made no move to thank her. Instead, he turned toward the hallway. "They're calling everyone to the backyard. It's time." She waited until he left before following. Her fingers lingered on the wood one last time. Then she turned and walked toward the porch, her steps steady. Outside, the chairs were full. The setting sun cast long shadows across the grass. The podium stood in its place, flanked by two floral arrangements. Her father stood near it, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and church elders. He wore his signature expression, a blend of solemnity and showmanship. Naomi took a seat in the third row beside a cousin she barely knew. The hum of anticipation filled the air. Her mother took her place near the edge of the crowd, near the children. Michael and James stood proudly with their families. They formed the tableau of continuity. Harris men, strong and present, flanked by their wives and children. Naomi sat apart, though not by choice. The host of the event, one of the senior pastors, stepped to the microphone and began the formal remarks. A tribute to leadership. A story of humble beginnings. Anecdotes about the early days of the ministry, the construction of the church, the first revival that had drawn hundreds. Naomi had heard it all before. She listened now with a practiced expression, detached. When her father finally stepped to the podium, the crowd fell silent. The air thickened with reverence. "Thank you all," he began, "for being here on this day of reflection and celebration. I look out at this gathering and feel humbled by the journey God has led us on." Naomi closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "My family has been the cornerstone of that journey," he continued. "My brothers and sisters in the ministry, my colleagues, my beloved wife Karen, who has stood by me with strength and grace. And of course, my children, those who carry the Harris name forward with integrity and purpose." He gestured toward Michael and James. Michael, whose business acumen has kept the church's financial arm thriving. James, whose work in youth outreach has brought new life into our programs. Their families reflect the values we hold dear: commitment, faith, legacy. There was applause. Naomi sat still. He did not mention her. her name was not spoken. Instead, he turned the speech toward legacy, toward the meaning of bloodlines, the sacred duty of passing the torch to those who walk in our footsteps. He spoke of tradition, of inheritance, not money, but purpose. Naomi felt the sting rise again, familiar and sharp. Then, as the sun dipped lower, he added, "Not all roads lead home, and not all journeys reflect the values from which they came. But we remain faithful. We remain steadfast. The body of the family endures because the voice remains true." Applause again. Her hands gripped the arms of the chair. The rejection wasn't new, but this was different. This was public. When the program ended, people began milling about again, moving toward the buffet and the seating areas. Naomi stood slowly, her limbs stiff. She turned away from the crowd, walking along the edge of the yard toward the shadows near the hedges. Behind her, the laughter of cousins. The deep voice of her father still mingling with guests. She leaned against the side of the house, her breath shallow, her throat tightened. The words replayed in her mind. Not all roads lead home. He had erased her from the narrative in front of everyone, and no one had corrected him. She slid her hand into her purse. Her fingers found the envelope, still sealed, still waiting. Not yet, she told herself, but soon. The illusion had cracked. The weight of the silence had shifted. She would not sit still much longer. Night had settled over the house like a velvet curtain, soft and suffocating, cloaking every surface in silence and carefully arranged pretense. Naomi lay awake in the guest bed, her eyes tracing the ceiling, the ridges of plaster catching faint moonlight from the window. The voices from earlier still echoed faintly in her mind. The laughter, the polite applause, her father's voice rising above the crowd with the practiced authority of a man who knew how to command a room. He had stood before them all, perfectly composed, delivering a speech that felt more like a sermon than a family reflection. A sermon that named his legacy and made it clear she was not part of it. She hadn't cried. Not then. Not after. Instead, she'd wandered the backyard long after the speeches ended, drifting past the folding chairs and the slowly emptying tables. The guests had moved on to dessert and conversation. No one mentioned her absence. No one looked for her. She had eventually returned inside, her heels muted against the floorboards, passed unnoticed through the living room where her gift still sat in its designated corner like an object in a museum. Revered, isolated, untouched. Now, as the house slept, Naomi remained restless. Her body was exhausted, but her thoughts churned. Something had shifted inside her during that speech. It wasn't just the omission, it was the deliberateness of it. The careful selection of words designed to cut her out of the story, to remind her that presence didn't equal belonging. He hadn't simply forgotten her. He had chosen not to include her. Her name had been intentionally absent. She rose quietly, wrapping a sweater around herself, and stepped into the hallway. The house creaked beneath her feet, the familiar sounds of old wood settling. She passed family photos and the curated snapshots of a life she had never quite been allowed to inhabit. Downstairs, she moved toward the sitting room, drawn not by curiosity but necessity. The artifact stood where it had all day, the lamplight still spilling across its polished surface. Naomi ran her fingers along the carved edge, tracing the wood's imperfections. The crack her father had remembered was still faintly visible, but it had been mended, carefully, purposefully, like something worth saving. She sat on the edge of the couch, facing the fireplace, the silence folding around her. Her purse rested on the table nearby. She stared at it. The envelope was inside, untouched but omnipresent. She didn't reach for it, not yet, but the choice of when, if, no longer felt distant. It was looming, close. Her phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from a college friend back in Chicago, congratulating her on the Tribune piece about her housing project. Naomi let the phone dim again. The recognition felt irrelevant here. Success meant little in a house where only one narrative mattered. By morning, the house had returned to its usual rhythm. Her mother was already dressed, preparing breakfast for the few overnight guests. Naomi joined her in the kitchen, wordless. They moved around each other in silence, the choreography of strangers who shared blood but not language. "He'll be at the church this morning," her mother finally said. Naomi nodded. "There's a small service at 10. He'll want the family to attend." Another nod. She ate quickly, changed into a modest gray dress, and followed her cousins into the car headed for the church. The ride was filled with casual chatter, discussions about business and children and vacation homes. Naomi stared out the window, watching the town pass in a blur of weathered storefronts and oak-lined streets. The Harris family church was a red brick building with white columns and a modest steeple. It sat on a quiet block just off Main Street, surrounded by a perfectly trimmed lawn and a black iron fence. Naomi had grown up here. Sunday after Sunday, she had sat in these pews, listened to her father preach, memorized the verses he assigned, absorbed the doctrine like it was oxygen. She had learned to keep still, to stay quiet, to be obedient in body, if not in thought. Inside, the sanctuary was bright with stained glass. The choir loft was empty, the pulpit adorned with fresh flowers. The space smelled of lemon polish and memory. Naomi took a seat near the back, avoiding the cluster of family members in the front rows. The congregation was smaller today, mostly close friends and church elders. The real service had happened yesterday. This was a formality, an encore performance. Her father entered from the side door, wearing his usual black suit and clerical collar. He moved to the pulpit without hesitation, his presence commanding. The room quieted. Naomi watched him closely. He began with a prayer, then moved into a short message. Gratitude, legacy, family, the same themes. But this time his tone shifted. He spoke of lineage, of names, of what it meant to carry a legacy. "We are defined," he said, "not just by our faith, but by our blood, by the continuity of values passed from one generation to the next. That is what makes a family strong. That is what makes a name endure." Naomi's stomach clenched. She knew this script, but now she understood its undertones more clearly. "There are those," he continued, "who stray from the foundation, who build elsewhere, who forget their roots. And while we pray for them, we must also protect the sanctity of the family from dilution." Dilution. The word struck her like a slap. He didn't look at her, not once, but the message was clear. Naomi sat frozen, her nails digging into her palm. Around her, no one flinched. The congregation accepted the words with nods and murmurs. The ritual was familiar, but to her it was warfare in disguise. A public disavowal cloaked in scripture. The service ended. Her cousins congratulated her father on another stirring message. The elders shook his hand, their eyes filled with reverence. Naomi slipped out the side door. She stood in the parking lot, breathing deeply, trying to push the tremor back down. Her heart pounded in her ears. He would never see her. Not because she wasn't good enough, but because she wasn't his. She returned to the house ahead of the others. In the quiet, she walked to the study, a room she'd rarely been allowed to enter as a child. The door was ajar. She stepped inside. The room was lined with books, Bibles, theology, history. A globe stood in the corner. The desk was immaculate. Naomi moved to it, her fingers brushing the edge. A single photo sat in a silver frame, her father, Michael, and James standing outside the church. No daughters, no Naomi. She sat in the leather chair behind the desk. It felt too large, too rigid. She reached into her purse and withdrew the envelope. She placed it in the center of the desk. Not to leave it. To look at it. To feel its weight in the room that had symbolized power and exclusion her entire life. Her mother found her there. She stepped into the room quietly, her eyes falling to the envelope, then to Naomi's face. Karen hesitated. "What is that?" Naomi didn't answer immediately. "I need to talk to you," she said softly. Her mother nodded, closing the door behind her. They sat in silence. "I know he's not my father," Naomi said finally. "Biologically." Karen closed her eyes, her hands folded in her lap. "I did a test. I didn't plan to, but I did. Twice." Her mother opened her eyes again. They glistened with unshed tears. "How long have you known?" Naomi asked. Karen's voice was barely audible. "Since before you were born." Naomi's breath caught. "He offered to marry me anyway," her mother said. "He said no one had to know, that we could still have a family, a future, and I wanted to believe him." Naomi stared at her. "He promised he would raise you as his own," Karen whispered. "But he never could. Not really." Naomi's voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I thought I was protecting you. Because I was ashamed. Because I didn't know how." They sat in silence again. Naomi's hand trembled as it rested near the envelope. "He treated me like a stranger," she said, "and I kept trying to become someone he'd see." Her mother's tears fell freely now. "I'm sorry," she said. It was not enough, but it was something. Naomi stood, taking the envelope with her. She looked down at the desk. "I'm not giving this to him yet, but I want him to know it exists." Karen nodded. As Naomi left the study, she felt the weight of the truth settle around her, not as a burden, but as clarity. The illusion was broken, and she would no longer pretend. The next move would be hers. The day had bloomed with unbearable quiet. It was the kind of silence Naomi had known all her life, measured, constructed, pressurized, like the walls of this house, like the rooms that had seen her grow from a silent girl to an invisible woman, like the man at its center who had given her his name, but withheld everything else. The conversation with her mother from the previous evening still pulsed in her chest like a bruise too deep to see. She had carried the envelope with her into sleep and into waking, and now it lay inside her purse again, but its presence was louder than ever. She walked through the house that morning with the slow, intentional movements of someone who had made up her mind. Breakfast was being prepared for the last of the weekend guests. Her mother moved mechanically through the kitchen, her face pale, her mouth tight, her usual grace slightly cracked at the edges. There was no further mention of their conversation, no reference to what had passed between them in the study or what had been confirmed. Karen had folded herself back into function, but Naomi could see the fatigue beneath her silence. The dining room had been reset for a formal meal. Polished flatware, neatly ironed napkins, name cards inscribed in careful calligraphy. The air in the house smelled of roasted herbs and something faintly metallic. Naomi stared at her assigned seat, noticing again how far down the table it was. Not with the elders, not with the center of the family, just out of reach, just on the edge, as she always had been. She excused herself and went upstairs to change. Her suitcase lay open on the bed. Her clothes, methodically folded at the beginning of this trip, were now in mild disarray, bearing the imprint of her movements and indecision. She selected a black dress, simple and sleeveless, with a high neckline and a slim belt. It gave her structure. It helped her breathe. Downstairs, the house began to fill once more. Guests returned, some of them unfamiliar, others only vaguely recalled from her childhood. Church board members, distant cousins, family friends who had known Naomi only as a baby, and now marveled at how grown up she looked, as if adulthood had emerged in her absence. She nodded through the pleasantries. She smiled with her mouth, but not her eyes. The family took their places as the meal began. Her father entered the dining room last, as was his custom, and the room hushed the moment he appeared. His presence seemed to demand silence even without words. He wore a navy suit this time, more relaxed than his Sunday attire, but still formal, still carefully pressed. His eyes swept the table once, pausing briefly on Michael, then James, and finally landed on Naomi with a look that offered nothing. No warmth, no acknowledgement, just observation. They bowed their heads for grace. Her father's voice led the prayer, steady and deep, invoking unity and gratitude and legacy. Naomi did not close her eyes. As the meal unfolded, the conversation flowed in predictable currents. Her cousins spoke of real estate ventures and school admissions. The wives complimented recipes and discussed summer camps. Her father directed questions like an orchestra conductor, ensuring each voice aligned with the desired harmony. When Naomi's name came up, it was her mother who mentioned it, softly, hesitantly. Naomi's project in Chicago was in the Tribune last week, she said. A feature on the new housing development in Bronzeville. There was a brief pause, a few polite expressions of interest. Naomi waited. Her father did not look up. "Good," he said. Then, to Michael, "How is the zoning application for the East Side property coming?" The pivot was sharp, immediate. Conversation resumed without her. Naomi felt the familiar burn rise behind her eyes, but she forced herself to swallow it. She had prepared for this, had rehearsed every word she might say, had steeled herself for the moment when the truth would need to rise like a tide. Dessert was served. Lemon cake with sugared fruit, her father's favorite. She could hardly taste it. The silverware clinked against porcelain like distant bells. The conversation grew louder, more relaxed. Wine flowed, laughter returned. Naomi reached into her purse. The envelope was there, warm now from her hand, still sealed, still intact. She stood slowly. The movement caught no attention at first. It was not uncommon for her to excuse herself from crowded spaces. She had always been a shadow in this house, and no one noticed when shadows moved. But when she walked past the head of the table and stopped directly behind her father's chair, the room quieted. Her mother turned first, her eyes wide with quiet dread. Her father looked over his shoulder, the expression on his face unreadable. Naomi cleared her throat. Her voice was steady, stronger than she expected. "I'd like to say something," she said. Chairs shifted. The room stilled. Her father said nothing. He gestured once, barely perceptible, a permission, or perhaps a challenge. Naomi took a breath. The silence in the room had weight now. It hung over them like fog. "For as long as I can remember," she began, "I've tried to understand why nothing I did was ever enough, why every success was met with silence, every effort received with skepticism. I graduated at the top of my class, built my own practice, became the youngest lead architect in the city's housing program. I did everything right. And still I remained outside." She paused, scanning the faces around the table. Some were confused, others uncomfortable. Her mother's hands were clenched in her lap. "I used to think the problem was me," Naomi continued, "that I was flawed, too ambitious, too different, not obedient enough, not soft enough, not the daughter you imagined." Her father's jaw flexed. Still, he said nothing. "But the truth," she said, lifting the envelope and placing it on the table before him, "is that I was never your daughter to begin with." Gasps broke the silence. The envelope sat between them, unassuming and white. "I had a DNA test done," Naomi said, "twice. The results confirmed what I think you've known all along. You're not my biological father." The room was still. Her father stared at the envelope. His face remained blank. "I don't say this to hurt you," she added, her voice quieter now. "I say this because I've carried this truth alone for too long, and I'm done performing for a place in a family that was never mine to begin with." Her mother rose abruptly, a hand over her mouth. She turned and left the room without a word. Michael and James sat stunned, their expressions a mix of disbelief and offense. Some guests looked down at their plates, others whispered. Her father reached for the envelope. He did not open it. Instead, he stood. His height had always been imposing, but now it felt diminished, his authority cracked by the quiet blade of science and confession. He looked at her, his gaze harder than she had seen in years. "Get out of my house," he said. It was soft, deadly. Naomi did not flinch. "I was already leaving," she replied. She turned, walked back down the length of the table, past the stunned silence of cousins and elders and clergy, past the polished furniture and floral arrangements, past the hallway photos she would never be in. At the front door, she paused, slid her shoes back on, lifted her purse. Outside, the sky had begun to darken. The air was heavy with the scent of summer rain. She walked to her car. The artifact she had gifted him remained inside the house, like a monument to a version of herself that had tried too long to belong. She had brought it in good faith. He had hidden it in shame. She unlocked the car, opened the door. From the porch, voices rose, someone calling her name. Maybe her mother. Maybe not. Naomi got in, started the engine. The sound of tires against gravel filled her ears like music. She drove away from the Harris house, from the carefully manicured lawn, from the history that had tried to define her. She did not look back. The hotel room was modest, tucked into the fourth floor of a quiet business-class hotel on the edge of downtown Atlanta. Naomi had checked in just after dusk, still wearing the black dress from her father's dinner, still carrying the same purse, though now noticeably lighter without the envelope. She had not spoken since leaving the house. The drive had been long enough for her hands to stop shaking, for her throat to stop burning, but her thoughts spun endlessly, like tires stuck in mud. She stood at the window, staring down at the city lights that blinked in soft rhythm. Her reflection floated on the glass, ghost-like, angular, weary. The edges of her control were frayed. Beneath her collarbone, a sharp ache throbbed, the kind that came from tension long held and finally released. She pressed her fingers there, but it did nothing to stop the weight pressing in from within. The phone on the desk lit up. 21 missed calls. 12 text messages. The last ones from her mother. "Please call me." He's furious. "They're trying to claim you made it all up. Come back. We need to talk." She turned the phone face down and moved to the bed. Her bag remained unopened on the floor. She didn't want to unpack. She didn't want to sit still. Instead, she lay on top of the duvet, arms folded across her chest, and closed her eyes. Her mind replayed the scene again and again. Her voice in the quiet room, her mother's departure, her father's eyes narrowing before delivering the final blow. "Get out of my house." And still, there had been no tears. Sleep came fitfully and broke early. By morning, she was up before the sun, showered, dressed. She made her way to a small coffee shop near the hotel. The early hour left the streets mostly empty. She welcomed the quiet. It allowed her to move unseen, without the pressure of expectations, without having to smile for anyone. She sat at a corner table with a bitter coffee and no appetite. Her laptop sat closed on the table in front of her. Work emails stacked in the dozens, but she couldn't bring herself to open them. For the first time in years, deadlines meant nothing. Even her clients, even her practice felt distant. Her identity had been built like scaffolding, achievement over silence, progress over pain. But now the foundation had shifted, and everything she thought she stood on felt uncertain. She checked the messages again. Still more. Her mother had called at 1:43 a.m. no voicemail, just the timestamp of a silent plea. She answered none of them. That afternoon, Naomi drove to the outskirts of the city, toward a neighborhood lined with modest homes and dense trees. She had done the research in the weeks following her DNA test, but had never dared to act on it until now. The records hadn't been difficult to trace. Her mother's college yearbooks had listed his name. Her last confession had given the final clue: Thomas Keller, professor of architectural history, MIT, class of '85, deceased according to public records, but survived by a family, 2 sons, a daughter, and a widow named Elena. They lived in California now, but once they had lived here. She parked down the street and stepped out slowly, nerves alive beneath her skin. The house was small, pale yellow, with a brick chimney and a trimmed lawn. There was nothing extraordinary about it, but Naomi stood for a long moment, watching the windows, trying to imagine what her life would have looked like if it had started here. If the man who had passed down her love for design, her hands, her curious mind, had known of her existence. She didn't go to the door. It wasn't time. Maybe it never would be. But standing there, something inside her shifted again, not in anger, but in clarity. She was the sum of many silences, but she was not defined by them. Back at the hotel, Naomi opened her laptop and began to type. Not to clients, not to colleagues, but to the address she had found in the alumni registry, Thomas's widow. She didn't expect a response. She didn't even know what she would say, but the words came anyway. "My name is Naomi Harris. I believe I may be the daughter of your late husband." She hesitated, then added, "I don't want anything from you, only the truth." She stared at the cursor, blinking at the bottom of the email, then hit send. The reply came 2 days later. "Dear Naomi, your message left me breathless. I'm not surprised. Please call me when you're ready." Elena's phone number followed. Naomi waited another day before dialing. Her hands trembled as she listened to the dial tone. When the line connected, the voice on the other end was soft, unsure. They spoke for an hour. Elena was careful, measured, but kind. She told Naomi that Thomas had spoken often of the woman he had loved in college, that he had never known she was pregnant, that he had wondered, sometimes aloud, if he had left something behind. Naomi cried for the first time that night. Quiet, contained sobs, not for the loss of a man she never met, but for the confirmation that he had existed, that he had not abandoned her, that he might have loved her had he known. In the weeks that followed, Naomi returned to Chicago. Her apartment, once a fortress of isolation, felt different now, less like armor. She resumed work slowly, fielding emails, taking meetings. Her staff welcomed her back without questions. She appreciated their silence. She contacted the city and finalized the paperwork for her new development, the first female-led, minority-owned architectural project to receive full municipal grant backing in years. She declined interviews. She turned down magazine features. Instead, she met with organizers, young designers, women from underfunded communities who had always dreamed of building something lasting. She launched her foundation a month later. The Harris name was nowhere in sight. It was called the Resilient Line, the tagline for those who build where no foundation was given. Her mother called occasionally. At first, it was cautious, checking in, no pressure, just soft inquiries. Naomi answered, sometimes. There was pain still, but there was also something new: honesty. It would take time to rebuild anything that resembled closeness, but the performance had ended. That was something. One evening, Naomi returned home to find a small envelope slid under her door. No return address. Inside was a photograph. Her father, standing on the porch of the house, the artifact she had given him placed behind him now, displayed on a pedestal beside the front door. No note, just the image. She stared at it for a long time. It didn't undo anything, but it was, perhaps, the closest he would ever come to acknowledgement. She placed the photo in a drawer and walked to her desk. The Foundation's next project was waiting, an all-women's design collective in the West Loop. As she opened the blueprints, Naomi smiled, not for validation, not for victory, but for freedom. She had given back the name that never fit and chosen her own. Winter settled over Chicago with an elegance that felt earned. The lake had hardened into a mirror of frozen silver, and the streets glittered with frost before dawn. Naomi stood inside the glass atrium of her new foundation headquarters, watching as the sun rose slowly over the city, pouring pale light over the skyline she now claimed as her own. Behind her, the sound of the morning preparations hummed softly, assistants arranging seating charts, caterers unloading trays, interns checking audio equipment. Today marked the official launch of the Resilient Line's first major public project, and the atmosphere in the room pulsed with purpose. She adjusted the sleeve of her tailored jacket, black with a single white stripe that ran like a quiet assertion down her right arm. The outfit was hers by design, symbolic, a statement of balance, of movement, of restraint without apology. She had dressed herself today not for power, but for clarity. The last few months had been a slow, deliberate rebuilding, not of her career, which had remained intact despite the storm she had walked through, but of her own interior architecture. The hollow spaces left by years of rejection had begun to fill, not with noise, not with accolades, but with substance, with self-knowing, with honesty. Since the day she walked out of her father's house, Naomi had taken no calls from Michael or James. Her mother had sent letters, small updates and hesitant reflections folded with care, but always edged in guilt. Karen had apologized again and again, sometimes directly, sometimes through the silence between her words. Naomi responded when she had the strength, offering short replies that held no warmth, but also no hatred. She understood now that some people loved in ways too fragile to endure confrontation. Her mother had loved her, but quietly, under glass. That love had not saved her from the ache of being dismissed, but it had given her enough breath to stand again. The invitation list for today's event had been curated with intention. No family names, no public officials with ties to her past, only the people who had believed in the work. Activists, artists, teachers, survivors of generational poverty and erasure. Black women who had never been given space to speak, now seated at the center of the room. The new building itself was proof of concept, a community-designed, community-owned co-working and resource center built in Bronzeville, constructed entirely by minority-owned firms, including the apprentices she had mentored. As the room filled, Naomi moved gracefully among the guests. She greeted elders with both hands, clasped younger women by the shoulders, looked each speaker in the eye. Her presence was deliberate and grounded, no longer reaching, no longer asking. She no longer performed her worth. She simply embodied it. The ceremony began just before 10. The main hall filled with natural light as the skylight shifted, and the audience settled into quiet anticipation. Naomi walked to the center stage, not elevated, just circled by open floor, and took her place behind the podium. No barriers, no table to separate her, just her voice and theirs. She began not with statistics or mission statements, but with a story. "There was a time," she said, "when I believed that belonging had to be earned, that if I could work hard enough, speak well enough, build beautifully enough, I could find my place in a family that always made me feel like an outsider, that if I was obedient, careful, modest, I would eventually be seen." The audience was still. I spent decades molding myself around that hope. I wore it like a second skin, even when it chafed, even when it bled. But what I didn't know, what took me years to discover, is that belonging is not something granted by others. It is something we build, and like any structure worth living in, it must be anchored in truth. She paused. "My truth is this. I am the daughter of a man who raised me but never accepted me. I am the daughter of a woman who loved me but could not protect me. And I am also the daughter of someone I never met, a man who passed down a passion for architecture in my bones, even if he never knew my name." Murmurs moved gently through the room. I was not chosen by blood, but I chose myself by truth, and that, in the end, is what built this place. There was a quiet breath that followed her words, not applause, but stillness, reverence. She continued, describing the plans ahead: the scholarship fund, the mentorship circles, the design incubator for formerly incarcerated women. She spoke not just of healing, but of blueprinting a new model of legacy, one that could not be revoked, ignored, or inherited without responsibility. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and musicians began to play soft jazz in the background, Naomi stepped aside to take a breath. She stood near the cornered display, where a small exhibit showed the story of the Foundation's creation. Among the items was a photograph, one taken of her at a construction site, helmet askew, laughing with a group of women in coveralls. Another frame held a plaque bearing the quote she had chosen as the Foundation's motto: "We are what we make space for." She noticed a figure near the entrance, lingering. An older woman, dressed plainly, with snow-white hair and warm brown eyes. Naomi recognized her at once, though they had never met in person. Elena Keller. She moved through the crowd with quiet certainty and stopped in front of Naomi, hands folded. "I told you I didn't expect anything," Naomi said, her voice softer than she intended. Elena smiled. "I know, but I needed to see." They embraced, carefully at first, then fully. Naomi felt her throat tighten. "He would have been proud," Elena said into her ear. "He loved beauty with a purpose." Naomi pulled back. "Thank you for telling me the truth." "It was never yours to carry alone," the woman replied. They stood like that for a long moment, not mother and daughter, not even family in the formal sense, but tethered by something greater: honesty, mutual courage. Later that evening, After the guests had gone and the last team members had finished cleanup, Naomi returned to the main hall. The lights had dimmed, but the city glowed through the windows, golden and quiet. She sat on the floor in the center of the room, crossed her legs, closed her eyes. She remembered herself at 7, sitting at the edge of the pew, listening to her father preach about righteousness and loyalty and blood. She remembered herself at 17, staring in the mirror the night before graduation, wondering why he hadn't said he was proud. She remembered herself at 27, building a career brick by brick, thinking that maybe if she succeeded enough he'd change his mind. She thought of the moment she stood behind his chair, her hand trembling as she placed the envelope in front of him. The sound of her own voice as she named the truth for everyone to hear. The silence that followed. She had not returned to that house. She never would. But she had built another, a house of purpose, a house of chosen family, a house where her name rang with strength. She rose, brushed off her pants, and walked to the wide glass wall that overlooked the city. In the reflection, she saw herself, tall, whole, and unsilenced. She whispered the words she had longed to hear all her life. I am enough. Then, louder, I always was. And for the first time, there was no doubt left in her voice. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our next video and share this one with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps these stories reach the people they are meant for.